Hello and welcome to another episode of the Halloween Podcast. I am your host, Lyle Perez, and you're listening to episode 46 of our special series, The Dark Record, where we uncover history's eeriest stories, one strange and unsettling case at a time. In the summer of 1878, in the quiet town of Amherst, Nova Scotia, a family home became the stage for Canada's most famous haunting. An 18-year-old woman named Esther Cox found herself at the center of violent knocks, fires, and a chilling message scrawled by an unseen hand. Esther Cox, you are mine to kill. The next entry into the dark record, the Great Amherst Mystery. Let's begin. The story of the Amherst haunting begins not with ghosts, but with a young woman in the aftermath of trauma. Esther Cox was just 18 years old in 1878, living in a modest wooden house in Amherst, Nova Scotia. She shared the home with her married sister, Olive Teed, Olive's husband Daniel, their 2 children, and several siblings. The house was crowded but typical of small-town life in late 19th century Canada. That summer, Esther endured something that shook her deeply. A family acquaintance named Bob McNeil, who had shown interest in her, tried to force himself on her. The assault failed, but the terror of that night left Esther shaken, withdrawn, and fragile. In the weeks that followed, those closest to her noticed her health decline. She suffered fevers, chills, and fainting spells. It was during this period of weakness that the first strange events began. Late one night in August, Esther awoke in distress. She claimed her body felt swollen and hot, as if under attack from within. Her family rushed to her bedside, only to hear loud banging from beneath the bed frame. At first, they thought it was a prank, but the pounding continued even as they searched the room. Soon after, household items began to move without explanation. Bedclothes torn away, a pillow sliding across the floor. The Teeds were frightened but assumed Esther's illness was causing hallucinations. Within days, the disturbances grew. Neighbors visiting the house reported hearing sharp knocks and raps that seemed to answer questions. 2 knocks for yes, 1 for no. Objects were hurled across rooms, sometimes narrowly missing Esther herself. On one occasion, a sewing basket rose and overturned in front of witnesses. Another time, Esther cried out in terror as a heavy bedclothes chest slid across the room by itself. The family called in Dr. Corritt, a local physician, to examine her. He arrived skeptical but quickly changed his tone. During his visit, the knockings grew louder, as though responding to his questions. Then, before his eyes, a message seemed to appear. Words forming on the plaster wall, spelling out, "Esther Cox, you are mine to kill." For Corritt, a man of science, it was a moment he could not explain. Word spread quickly through Amherst. The Teed house, once quiet and ordinary, had become the site of nightly disturbances, knocks, raps, and flying objects that no one could account for. The family began to fear for Esther's life, believing she was under siege by something malevolent. For Esther herself, the ordeal was only beginning. As the weeks passed, the disturbances inside the Teed home grew not only louder, but more violent. What began with knocks and raps soon escalated into physical assaults on the space itself. Household items moved at random, dishes flew from cupboards, and furniture shifted without human touch. Esther, already fragile from her earlier trauma, seemed to bear the brunt of it. She often cried out in pain, claiming unseen hands scratched her skin or pricked her with pins. Witnesses confirmed her cries were followed by sudden welts and marks that appeared on her body. The violence extended beyond scratches. One night, as the family gathered, a knife launched across the kitchen, embedding itself in the wood near Esther. On another occasion, a heavy stove lid was flung to the floor with such force it startled even the most skeptical neighbors. People who had dismissed the stories began to reconsider when they experienced the phenomena firsthand. Amherst, a small town where word traveled quickly, was soon buzzing with rumors of the haunting on Princess Street. The most terrifying manifestations were fire. Small blazes would suddenly erupt in corners of the house, on bedding, in piles of cloth, even on the floorboards. The family worked frantically to extinguish them, fearing their home would be consumed. To them, the intent was obvious. Whatever force haunted Esther wanted her driven out or destroyed. The disturbances were not confined to the Teed home. When Esther, desperate for relief, went to stay with neighbors or friends, the phenomena followed. People who had opened their doors in kindness soon regretted it when raps, scratches, and moving objects began in their own homes. Esther's reputation spread beyond Amherst as the girl tormented by spirits. It was during this period that Walter Hubble, a young actor touring the region, heard of Esther's plight. Fascinated and claiming an interest in psychic phenomena, he asked to stay in the Teed house to witness the events himself. Over the course of several weeks, Hubble kept notes of what he saw. He described objects thrown with no human hand, mysterious wrappings, answering direct questions, and even fires igniting in Esther's presence. Hubble later published his account as The Great Amherst Mystery, a book that would make Esther's ordeal known far beyond Nova Scotia. In his writing, Hubble portrayed Esther as both victim and reluctant medium, a young woman caught between worlds and used by unseen forces to make their presence known. He even convinced Esther to join him on a lecture tour, where she publicly told her story while Hubble read from his notes. The tour brought attention but also skepticism, as some accused them of profiting from tragedy. When Esther returned home, the hauntings resumed, more violent than before. By now, the Great Amherst Mystery was more than a local tale. It was becoming one of the most documented poltergeist cases in North America. Yet even as believers flocked to see Esther, critics began to question whether what they were witnessing was supernatural or staged. For all the astonishment the Amherst case inspired, it was not without its critics. From the beginning, there were whispers that Esther Cox was not a victim of spirits, but a young woman under strain, perhaps even a fraud. One of the earliest skeptics was Dr. Walter Prince, a researcher with the American Society for Psychical Research. Writing decades later in 1919, Prince reviewed the case and pointed out troubling patterns. The poltergeist's identity, said to be Bob Nickel, bore a striking resemblance to the name of Bob McNeil, the man who had assaulted Esther only weeks before the hauntings began. To Prince, this suggested that the haunting was less about spirits and more about Esther's mind grappling with trauma, her subconscious projecting terror into physical form. Others were harsher. Egon Larson, a 20th century commentator on paranormal claims, dismissed the Amherst haunting as fraudulent trickery. He argued that Hubble, the young actor who had documented Esther's ordeal, exaggerated events for profit. His book, The Great Amherst Mystery, became a bestseller, and Larson accused him of sensationalizing or even inventing key details. The lecture tour only fueled these suspicions. Why would a girl tormented by violent forces agree to stand before crowds and perform her story? Even at the time, skeptics in Amherst voiced doubt. Some townspeople believed Esther craved attention, pointing to the way disturbances often intensified when outsiders were present. Fires broke out in suspiciously convenient ways. Scratches and welts appeared when witnesses weren't looking, and the knocks seemed to answer questions only after Esther spoke. These details cast a shadow over the authenticity of the haunting. Still, the case resisted easy dismissal. Too many people, neighbors, doctors, even ministers, had testified to seeing and hearing inexplicable phenomena. Dr. Corritt, who had watched the chilling words "Esther Cox, you are mine to kill" form on the wall, maintained that he could not explain what he had witnessed. And while critics accused Hubble of embellishment, no one could fully disprove every claim. Part of the controversy stemmed from the era itself. The late 19th century was steeped in spiritualism, with seances and ghost stories captivating audiences across North America. Amherst, like many communities, was fertile ground for tales of spirits and possession. To believers, Esther's story fit a familiar pattern, a young woman serving as the conduit for forces beyond comprehension. To skeptics, it was just as easily explained as hysteria, attention-seeking, or outright fraud. The Great Amherst Mystery became a battleground between these two perspectives. On one side, it stood as one of the most thoroughly witnessed poltergeist cases of its time. On the other, it was an example of how trauma, superstition, and spectacle could combine to create a legend. The truth, as with so many stories in the dark record, seemed to balance uneasily between. By 1879, the haunting had stretched on for more than a year. The Teed household was exhausted, and Esther's reputation as the Amherst Mystery Girl had spread far beyond Nova Scotia. But even as the attention grew, so did the strain. Esther found herself increasingly unwelcome, not because people doubted her story, but because they feared the disturbances that seemed to follow her. The breaking point came with fire. In one of the most dramatic incidents, flames erupted in a local barn shortly after Esther had been nearby. Suspicion fell squarely on her. Though evidence was thin, she was charged with arson. Found guilty, Esther spent a short time in jail before being released. After her imprisonment, the disturbances faded, whether because she was no longer under the same household pressures, or because the phenomenon had simply run its course. The violent manifestations ceased. Esther went on to live a quieter life. She married twice, raised children, and eventually moved to Massachusetts. When she died in 1912 at the age of 52, she was remembered locally not as a wife or mother, but as the girl at the center of Canada's most infamous haunting. Her name remained linked to the strange events in Amherst long after her death. The case itself lived on through the book by Walter Hubble, The Great Amherst Mystery, which continued to circulate for decades. Folklorists like Hereward Carrington later revisited the story, compiling accounts that blended Hubble's dramatic narrative with the testimonies of townsfolk. For believers in the paranormal, it stood as one of the strongest poltergeist cases in North America, filled with multiple witnesses, physical phenomena, and even a doctor's testimony. For skeptics, it was a cautionary tale of how exaggeration and credulity can create legends. Today, Amherst embraces its spectral past. The town has hosted Esther Fest, celebrating the local legend with theater performances, storytelling, and guided tours. Murals and historical markers preserve her image, turning what was once a source of shame into a piece of cultural heritage. The story has also inspired plays, novels, and podcasts, ensuring it continues to reach new audiences. The Great Amherst Mystery survives because it exists at the crossroads of folklore, trauma, and entertainment. It is both tragedy and theater, both the story of a vulnerable young woman and the tale of a restless spirit. Whether Esther was genuinely tormented by forces beyond comprehension or caught in the swirl of her own suffering, her story refuses to be forgotten. Amherst still carries her name, and each October, her legend stirs once more in the imagination of those who crave stories of the unexplained. What strikes me most about the Great Amherst Mystery isn't just the ghostly activity. It's the human story at its center. Esther Cox was a young woman who had just endured trauma at the hands of someone she knew and trusted. In the months that followed, she became the focal point of a storm of fear, suspicion, and fascination. Whether the events were supernatural, psychological, or a mix of both, it's hard to separate the haunting from Esther's state of mind and the pressures of her world. In Victorian Nova Scotia, women like Esther had little power and even less voice. Her claims, her screams in the night, her stories of being tormented by something unseen were filtered through men like doctors, ministers, and investigators. Even Walter Hubble, who believed her, turned her suffering into a best-selling book that enriched his reputation more than it helped her. The haunting gave Esther a strange kind of visibility, but it also trapped her in a role she couldn't escape: victim, spectacle, mystery girl. I think about how the poltergeist was said to take the name Bob Nickel, so close to Bob McNeil, the man who assaulted her. Was that a coincidence? Or was Esther's trauma manifesting in ways her community could only understand as haunting? For her neighbors, the fires and raps were evidence of spirits. But for us, looking back, it's hard not to see them as the echo of a deeper pain, psychological wounds externalized into something tangible. And yet, the legend survives not as a story of Esther's suffering, but as one of Canada's great ghost tales. Amherst celebrates her today with murals and festivals, remembering her as the girl who lived with the poltergeist. In a way, that cultural memory keeps her alive, but it also risks overshadowing the real person she was: a young woman navigating hardship, trapped in the public gaze, and struggling to reclaim her life. For me, the Great Amherst Mystery is less about whether spirits existed in that little house, and more about what happens when trauma, belief, and fear collide. The haunting may never be explained, but the story endures because it reveals how fragile the line is between tragedy and legend. That brings us to the end of episode 46 of The Dark Record. We followed the strange case of Esther Cox, from the first raps and scratches in her Amherst home to the fires, messages, and violent assaults that terrified her family and neighbors. Whether you believe she was tormented by spirits, undone by trauma, or caught in the swirl of superstition and spectacle, Esther's story lingers as one of the most famous hauntings in Canadian history, remembered, retold, and now added to the record. Next time, we'll travel to Germany in the 1970s, where a young woman named Anneliese Michel underwent a series of harrowing exorcisms. Her death and the trial that followed shocked the world and reignited debates about faith, medicine, and the presence of evil. We'll examine the exorcism of Anneliese Michel. Until then, I'm Lyle Perez, and this has been the Halloween Podcast presenting The Dark Record. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. It helps keep the show alive and weird. You can also explore sources, extras, and more at our Facebook page at facebook.com/The Halloween Podcast or at our website, thehalloweenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening. Keep your eyes on the shadows. And remember, the knocking may have stopped, but some hauntings never leave the house. Have a good night.